Welcome to the Indian Newslink podcast.
Indian Newslink is a community paper. It's the oldest paper in New Zealand.
Right.
We're now on our 25th year, and we are into almost all possible topics that could interest a wide array of readers. We take an unbiased view of all issues. Sometimes
And are you in print as well as audio or
we were
in video?
in print until recently, but print is become very obsolete because there's a lot of wastage. And this is a free paper. And as you know, when something is free, it has no value literally. So we poured our resources into digital. I'm an employee, he's the owner.
Oh, I see.
We have poured our resources into the digital platform. So apart from digital edition and a web edition, which is virtual 24/7, we also have podcast, videocast. We moved into those areas where there is a lot more live presence of people,
Yeah.
if you like. And that's so it has
So this
proved
goes on YouTube or
everywhere. This will go on Spotify, Amazon, YouTube. What else, Daryl? Maybe about 18 different platforms
Oh,
it
my
goes.
word. All right.
And because that's the reach we are getting nowadays, and there is a lot more accessibility. People are not even interested in opening their computers. They just want to open their mobile and watch. So we are moving into areas of even making our stories listenable instead of readable.
Right. Let's go. All
So
set.
anyway, I want to talk to you about New Zealand-India relations before we go to that. Having listened to the narratives and the way the election is being turning around, as it were, my question to you, sir, the opening question is, what if on June 5? That's my question.
What if?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's all the indications now that more than half the electorate has voted
Yeah.
are that we're looking at a change of government on June 5, or soon after anyway, because the way the system works, it's a parliamentary system, there are multiple parties in the fray. The perception is that come what may, the BJP will lose its majority in parliament. But since it'll probably still be the largest single party, it'll have to be asked first to try and form a government. It's very clear to us that they will not be able to form a government because their allies, who are very few in number and not terribly impressive, are not going to get the kind of seats that's going to make much of a difference to the BJP's fortunes. And nor will they be able to attract new allies. In fact, they, rather embarrassingly for them, publicly courted two particular parties that had left them in the past, the Biju Janata Dal in Odisha and the Akali Dal in Punjab, and both of them spurned the BJP rather openly, which was somewhat humiliating for the BJP. So I don't see any other parties coming in, particularly those who feel burned by earlier experiences of discussing with Mr. Modi the virtues of how to conduct themselves in governance. So I think that we're looking really frankly in a situation where the BJP is looking at the end of the road, but will not admit it. Nobody is willing to admit these things. We'll see how it goes in the next few weeks. There are only 3 phases left.
Yep.
One for
We're
each.
now going into the 5th phase.
That's right. So 5th phase is looming on the 20th. Then there is a 6th and a 7th phase. The final voting is on the 1st of June. And the earliest exit polls will be revealed at the end of that day. I'm not a huge fan of polling in India, partially because I think that the science of random selection of respondents is in any case much too difficult in a society as complex as India's and as heterogeneous as India's. And I think really to get accurate numbers, you would need samples of at least 1,000 in every one of the constituencies, and that's impossible in a country as big as India. So all our polls, exit or otherwise, tend to have a rather generous margin of error. And my own view is we may as well wait till the 4th and see what the final numbers are.
Yeah, so I think apart from the political scenario, which somewhat has descended to new depths of depravity in the last, especially 4 months, since Mr. Modi started in Banswar in Rajasthan, with his.
That's just 2-3 weeks ago. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, 2-3 weeks ago in Rajasthan, and thereon, it's been the rhetoric has been quite loud, getting louder and louder. Perhaps that was a turning point because, for the first time after many weeks, we found Rahul Gandhi openly confronting Modi and says, "Okay, give us the proof." When he spoke about the Ambanis and the Adanis. Because I think those were narratives which might have made people think. Sir, I don't know what was the polling in Thiruvananthapuram, because you have had from 61% you went to 63%, last time you went to 73.2%.
It's lower than that. However, what we are analyzing is that the decline in turnout has been most marked in the BJP strongholds, and there was no shortage of enthusiasm in areas where voters inclined towards me reside. So we are not particularly worried. And we're seeing similar phenomena elsewhere in the country. We've seen, for example, already in the first couple of phases, which is going on while I was campaigning in Kerala, so it's a second-hand news, if you like. But what I'm told by many in the north is that in the those districts in the Hindi-speaking states where voting took place, that in fact they actually found a decline specifically amongst absolute BJP strongholds.
You mean Rajasthan?
Rajasthan,
Uttar
Western
Pradesh.
UP, Madhya Pradesh, all these places. It looks like the core BJP voter is no longer so enthused by the BJP. And the worry for the BJP has been that the voters who were attracted in 14 and 19 on other grounds than Hindutva, that is, in 14 by economic development promises, job creation promises and so on of Mr. Modi, and in 19 by the national security issues triggered by the Pulwama bomb blast and the Balakot strike and so on. Those voters are not finding any reason to stay with Mr. Modi because his performance on both economic growth and national security have been so dismal that it's difficult to give him yet another term to do as badly as he's done in these two areas. And therefore the net result is that he has fallen back completely on this Hindutva message. And that has a very limited use, I think. You know, polarization rhetoric is unpleasant in any democracy. But in a country that for long has been hailed around the world as the embodiment of the successful management of diversity, it's particularly damning.
So, do you think the ruling party, BJP, has been hiding behind Hindutva to conceal its economic failures?
Yeah, I mean, that's one way of looking at it. My view is that it started off as their core message, Hindutva. They adopted Hindu Rashtra as their official objective. They're descended from the RSS, an organization which has been around since 1925, celebrates its centenary next year, and which has said some fairly blood-curdling things in its time. I mean, Mr. Golwalkar's famous comment that India should treat the Muslims the way Hitler dealt with the Jews has not been forgotten by many. And their core understanding is that India is some sort of pristine Hindu land, which has minorities living in India only on our sufferance, that is either as guests, by which he specifically meant only the Parsis and the Jews, or as interlopers and bandits, by which he meant both the Muslims and the Christians. Now, this is such a distorted reading of Indian history and India's demography that most of us find it completely beyond the pale. It's not acceptable. Unfortunately, this is the core ideology from which the Hindutva movement draws inspiration. And the difficulty is that in the 21st century, this is not only grossly sort of out of date, but it has been discredited by the failure of all such similar sort of ethno-nationalist ideologies to triumph anywhere in the world. Now, the irony is that India is not alone. You've seen the rise of Donald Trump with a very similar message in America. You've seen parties in Europe. Very few have come to power, but many have come into a strong second place in France, Netherlands, Austria, Germany. And in Britain, of course, they managed to deliver Brexit with a very backward-looking, xenophobic sort of campaign.
Now the Rwanda bill.
Yeah, well, the Rwanda bill is a little different, but I can explain that separately. But just to finish my examples, you also have in the rest of the world, you've got Turkey,
Yeah.
which is running a government rather like this. You have Mr. Putin, whose government is also maybe not so overtly demonizing any particular minority. They still seem to be ethno-nationalist in the more classic sense. And then you've got Mr. Modi, and Mr. Modi really seemed to have outgrown some of the worst elements of his political past. But as you rightly said, he has taken refuge once again in that core message because his attempts to broaden his appeal have foundered.
So, do you believe that the people of India are today seeing through the fact that the BJP government has failed to deliver on several issues? They have betrayed the people in terms of employment, in terms of protecting them cost of living, and as Professor Prabhakar was saying, lying to people about their performance, and therefore they're clinging on to the rhetoric of Muslim. Once again, he has spoken about it 2 days ago.
Though peculiarly, yesterday he said something that's bizarre and honestly difficult to understand how the same man could say this. Because after having done
Jihad vote, he's spoken
3 weeks of nothing but Muslim baiting, he suddenly says, I will never play the politics of Hindu-Muslim polarization. That would make me unworthy of office. Well, it does make him unworthy of office. But to say that today or yesterday was, to my mind, such a blatant contradiction. One wonders whether he's entirely all right, whether he's living in a world of his own.
So, in that case, why hasn't the Congress in the first instance and the India Alliance in the second instance bring about strongly the failures of the BJP in terms of feeding the people, feeding the poor, the education policy, etc.?
We are doing so to some degree. I mean, partly I think there's a tension between being accused of being relentlessly negative. That was an accusation against us in the last election. People are tired of negatives. They want a more positive message. We have one in our manifesto, and I was a member of the manifesto committee. We've come up with a very forward-looking social justice manifesto.
And I'm sure, I've also read it, there is no redistribution of wealth.
No, there's no reference. Nor does the word Muslim appear in it, unlike Mr. Modi's characterizations of it. But the fact is that that's the forward thing. However, I have frequently in my electoral speeches and interventions asked people a very basic question. Are you better off today than you were 10 years ago? Because my own question is, if you voted for Mr. Modi 10 years ago expecting to get a job, and you still don't have a job, why on earth do you want to give him a third chance?
40% now, the unemployment rate?
Well, youth unemployment is 42.5%.
Between 25 and 40.
No, between 19 and 25, the job starting age group. They are the ones who are finding it almost impossible to get a job. Partially because there are very few new jobs being created as well. But you find this across the board. For example, they promised to double farmers' incomes. Not only have they not doubled farmers' incomes, it's been
He's
barely
promised
10%
it in 2022
increase.
he would do.
And in his 10 years of rule, that is 100,000 farmers have committed suicide. Very sad story. Then you look at the overall income of the Indian, how much money do Indians have in their pockets? And you're looking at a situation where 80% of the population, and that's a rather significant number, have actually had no gains at all, and many have witnessed a loss of income in the last 10 years. Obviously, there were setbacks like the Modi-inflicted demonetization, which was a complete disaster and deprived a lot of people of their small businesses that depended on cash flow, and all collapsed. Right up to and including the COVID lockdown, which again was an unnecessarily extreme lockdown to begin with, which resulted
coming
in
to
lots
that
of
in a
loss
moment. I
of-
want your opinion on that, sir. Demonetization, Jacob, you'll remember, we were with Mr. Modi just 2 days before the demonetization took place. We went on a delegation with the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and there was some hush-hush. But of course, many people say that it has not worked, the purpose for which it was brought about. COVID-19 specifically, over the last few days or couple of weeks, there has been a lot of discussion about the after effects of COVID the medicine that was administered, there has been some talk about it in India. Do you want to comment on it, about the impact that it has had on the health of Indians?
On that issue, I am not one of those who wants to leap to attack the government. I think all governments have difficult choices to make in a crisis like that, and you can only make a decision on the basis of the information available to you at the time. The worldwide view was that vaccines were essential. We criticized the government ourselves for their lackadaisical planning during the first wave that left India woefully under-equipped with vaccines in the second wave, and we had a dramatically large death toll, estimated by WHO at 4.9 million, during a period in which bodies were being floated down the Ganga by people who couldn't even dare to cremate them or afford to cremate them. So it was a terrible time. And when the vaccinations were finally ramped up and everyone was vaccinated, we applauded the government. So it would be wrong now, with the benefit of hindsight, to say you shouldn't have done it. I am of the view that with every such thing, there is going to be possibly a sort of trade-off between the vast majority who will be protected from grave illness by the vaccine and the very small minority, in fact, as far as I know, a very, very modest number of cases by comparison with the size of the population, who may have indeed suffered long-term consequences or even suffered death. But the balance of probability being what it is, I think it's unlikely that we could have afforded to drop vaccination for everybody else and thereby incur a much higher fatality rate in order to avoid side effects for a very small number of people.
So the management of it is still being criticized?
The management at one time...
And it's not an election issue?
Yeah, no, it's not an election issue. The management in 2020-21, you remember the lockdown came in late February, early March of 2020. We survived. It was an unnecessarily stringent lockdown, many people's views, and the biggest victims were the migrant labor at that time, for whom no provision had been made because of lack of notice. Many walked hundreds of kilometers, many died on the way. It was terrible. Then by the end of 2020, there was a feeling that the pandemic was over. And Mr. Modi made a speech in Davos in January in which he rather lavishly praised himself, saying that he had sort of solved the world. And what little stocks he had left, he shipped off to certain developing countries, small islands in the Caribbean and so on, and earned himself some applause. Then came April, May of 2021, and sadly, the pandemic hit again very, very hard.
Cylinders were not available.
Oh, it was terrible. People were dying in the parking lots of hospitals because they could not get admission. And before they could turn away, the patient had died. There were also terrible stories, as I mentioned, of bodies being floated down the Ganga. The death toll was very artificially kept low by the government, but the WHO has done a very reasonable model saying you have to take what's called excess deaths into account. That is, you look at the typical pattern of deaths in a certain period every year. And if your deaths in this particular year exceeded that pattern, that means you have got excessive deaths in terms of expectations. So every year there is an expected death number of people for normal natural causes, etc. The excessive death toll, they estimated between 4.5 and 4.9 million. The Indian government claims the real number is 10% of that. I tend personally to believe the WHO because this government has not earned anybody's trust on any of its statistics.
So shifting to another matter, with the possibility of your government, Congress Party, coming into power, and with the possibility that with your expertise, the World Economic Forum has called you, I think they was it at the same meeting that they've given you a title, haven't they?
Oh, the Global Leader of Tomorrow. That was in
1998.
I'm afraid that tomorrow was yesterday.
Granting, hopefully, let's say that you might have something to do with foreign affairs, would you look at reshaping India's foreign policy? Do you think India has become assertive or arrogant or both?
Both under the present government. I think assertive.
And sorry to interrupt, Bharat Matters, why Bharat Matters, according to me, has followed more Mahabharata than Ramayana.
More the battlefield and
Now more of Shakuni.
Oh, well, there you are. I see part of the difficulty with the government is that in its desire to pander to its domestic constituency, it has lost sight of the basic point that diplomacy is the art of getting along with foreigners. So we've seen the foreign minister, who's a very skilled diplomat, somebody personally had a lot of regard for over the years, talking to Indian audiences like the Bharatiya Yuva Morcha in Bangalore and so on, BJP types, and saying things which almost as if he's unaware that they will be reported in the front pages of the English language
I thought on the
newspapers.
other hand they were aware they were being reported and therefore they did all that.
Well, the problem is in that case they're ruffling a lot of feathers unnecessarily.
They have.
Some of the comments.
Honestly.
And I do get a lot of ambassadors speaking to me in Delhi, and what I'm hearing from them is a certain level of dissatisfaction with the government's posturing. And this is not good for the government because, India was reputed to have punched above its weight globally because of the skill of our diplomats. Even at a time when our economy and our military strength and everything else didn't warrant it, we were looked up to in the world for a number of reasons.
So what would you do, sir? What would you do, first of all, to revisit India's foreign policy, taking it back? I remember the statement that was made by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru when he instituted the IFS, etc. And we've had stalwarts who have carried through the policy. I mean, we've had non-alignment, which was relevant at a point of time, and so on and so forth. In today's world, with such a polarization of forces, as it were, and the need for us to be actually talking to China rather than using television channels to talk rubbish, how would you, that's one part, and how would you deal with unexplored lands like New Zealand, which have not made any headway in the bilateral relations?
All right, so you asked a lot of questions on that. First of all, on non-alignment, I mean, yes, as a term and in the context in which it was devised, it's no longer relevant in the sense that there are no longer two superpowers to be non-aligned between, though China is emerging as a second superpower over again. But nonetheless, the idea behind non-alignment rested on a notion of strategic autonomy anchored in our own self-respect, that we are not going to be a country that other countries dictate to. And that principle remains all the more relevant as it was in 1947 when Nehruji first came up with it. Secondly, on China, I would slightly beg to differ because I think you can't afford to be extending the hand of friendship when and to a country which has behaved so badly unilaterally against you as China has. For 46 years, we had a modus vivendi on the border. And there were 65 patrolling points where both armies used to patrol, often on alternate days, and there were no incidents. Suddenly, the Chinese have decided that they don't want to have both armies patrolling. They have parked themselves in 26 of these areas,
So that's
built
LOAC
enduring. Beg your pardon?
You're talking about LOAC.
Across the line of control.
Actual control.
The disputed frontier between our two countries. And they have parked themselves, they've built enduring facilities and denied access to the Indian Army. And it was in one such episode the Indian Army said, "But you should leave now," sent unarmed soldiers to persuade them to leave. The 20 of our soldiers were killed in Galwan in June, beginning of June of 2020. Now, in these circumstances, I think that India simply cannot afford to be behaving as if business is normal, but we have been. The irony is, while the government talks bluster, in practice, our trade has shot up, our dependence on China.
Yeah, our imports have gone up by about $200 billion.
Well, almost 160, I think. But the point is, it's completely unfavorable terms of trade, and we're doing this to a country, giving benefits to a country which has kicked us in the teeth. And to my mind, that's not acceptable. So while I definitely believe in good relations with all powers, and I agree with the fundamental logic that you can't antagonize either the US or China in their emerging rivalry, I think we can't afford to overlook the fact that the US is not sitting on our border gobbling up our territory. The Chinese are. and therefore the Chinese will have to be dealt with some firmness. I was referring earlier to the broader tenor of our approaches to the world and our rhetoric, which needlessly has been offending and causing sort of ruffled feathers amongst countries we've traditionally had good relations with.
So are you
and
talking
need
of
to maintain.
Israel? Are you talking of Israel?
No, on Israel, it's a much more complicated mess because this government had needlessly, I think, given Israel a free pass as its attack on Gaza began, and now finds itself backtracking while the attack has gone far more and far longer.
Everybody
and far
is
worse,
talking about, yes.
than perhaps the government of India anticipated. But in the process, I'm not sure that it's won any friends anywhere. You see, I wrote during our notorious abstention in the first General Assembly resolution that how can the land of Gandhi abstain on a resolution that merely calls for peace? I mean, that didn't make any sense. It's not that I'm anti-Israel. On the contrary, I have been somebody who, at the UN, earned a reputation for navigating a decent relationship with both Israel and the Arabs. And I am proud to say that I conducted the UN's first ever seminar on anti-Semitism, and then its first ever seminar on Islamophobia. And that kind of even-handedness is what a world body should be all about. But it's also something which India, I think, resonates naturally with India because we have good relations with both sets of people. Unlike the Chinese situation, we don't have direct territory or people
So do you
at stake.
think
But just to finish the thought, my own view on this one is that we need not have, however, abandoned all our core principles, either when Russia invaded Ukraine or when Israel invaded Gaza. I think we could have said that we respect Israel's right of self-defense, but it does not extend to killing 40,000 people and destroying billions of dollars worth of property and essentially reducing an entire territory that is not yours to rubble. I mean, that is just inhumane.
So do you think some of the powers are expressing their frustration towards India's foreign policy in issues like Kejriwal's arrest? Do you think it's one of those things that they are quite so upset with India's foreign policy that they're even talking about internal issues of India?
Well, I think we've now been the object of the public expression of concern by a number of foreign ministries. The US State Department, they have their annual sort of report on religious freedom, which many of us can discount because no country has the right to be sitting in judgment on other countries' domestic policies. But nonetheless,
Our media does.
yeah,
in India.
and on human rights, they shouldn't. There was a time when we could proudly say that anything pointed out about our human rights record abroad had first been pointed out by an Indian non-governmental organization or by an Indian journalist or by an Indian activist. And there was nothing new. But today, the West is beginning to see itself as a custodian of human rights in India because the government does not offer a free hand and a free space to human rights activists in India to do their job properly. Similarly, the Germans have expressed concern about the strength of our democracy. The Varieties of Democracy Institute in Sweden, the most famous body that studies democracy worldwide, has actually downgraded India from a democracy into an electoral autocracy. That is, you elect your leader, but then the person conducts himself
That's
like
what
an autocrat.
India is branded as now.
So all of this is not something that I particularly value. Just yesterday, the news came that the intergovernmental body that accredits national human rights organizations for a second successive year has refused to accredit the National Human Rights Commission of India on the grounds that they were not convinced that this body was working or could work independently of the government. And the truth is that this is now becoming a widespread perception that the constitutionally autonomous bodies in India have had their autonomy hollowed out, and everyone else is under tremendous governmental pressure, including the press, the judiciary, the election commission, the information commission, pretty much anyone you can think of. And then the weaponization of the investigative agencies like CBI, ED, IT, revenue intelligence, all of this is embarrassing because it has put us in a position where the government is behaving openly in a manner that would not be considered democratic. and democracies elsewhere can see that. So all of this is not good, and I think that as far as India's image in the world is concerned, it will take nothing less than a change of government to be able to recoup the ground we have lost in the last 10 years.
So coming to New Zealand, I'm sorry that I'll try and make it faster. There has been strained relationship politically from 1982 when Indira Gandhi and Robert Muldoon had that spat. And after that, it has not been a very smooth road, despite 3 visits by 2 prime ministers to India. We have not had a prime ministerial visit. We've had 1 presidential visit in 2016 with Pranab Mukherjee. After that, there has been no. Rajiv Gandhi came here. That's about it. But nothing much has happened. So, do you see, as a person who so much in international, any potential for Indo-Kiwi relations to reboot and restart?
Yes, I mean, this is clearly a relationship that has not fulfilled its potential. There have been reasons, and slightly irritating ones, like the government caving into our dairy lobby against dairy imports from New Zealand, for example. So the free trade negotiations never got anywhere because of that. There's also a slightly condescending attitude in some bureaucratic circles in Delhi. I mean, what does New Zealand have to offer us? 5 million people and a bunch of sheep. I mean, come on, that kind of attitude. It's not been seen as a major priority. But conversely, you could look at the fact that there are no outstanding irritants in the relationship. There are no issues of major divergence. There are no political problems between the 2 countries in terms of worldview. There should be every reason why the 2 countries get along and develop their relations. We have the affinities of cricket and the English language and so on. Why don't we do much more to develop close relationships? I have to say that I think this is something which requires a bit of work from both sides. I think New Zealand too should ask itself, you're a 5 million country, what do you do to get and deserve the attention of the 140 billion people, 1.4 billion people sitting in India. So all of these things need to be looked at from both sides. I do feel, however, that the potential has not been tapped at all. And as the diaspora of Indians increase here, I'm hoping that India too will rise in salience, because we are, I think, 250,000 people in a 5 million population. That's a decent sort of 5%. Hopefully this 5% will grow and will also become more influential as they prosper in this society and start exerting pressure on the political class to do more.
In 2004, Dr. Manmohan Singh told us when we visited, he said, outside of dairy and agriculture, there can be a lot of potential that the 2 countries can look at growth path. And that includes transfer of technology, agro-technology, and various other things. The problem has been that there has been no political will and perhaps the bureaucratic will. So we are hoping that someone like you or your government, if it comes in, would you start fresh with New Zealand?
Yeah.
Because New Zealand is now itching because they realize that they have missed several buses. Bus after bus we've missed. And there has been a truncated agreement, I dare say that, because that's what it is as far as Australia is concerned. But where there could be more meaningful dialogue between the 2 countries.
Most definitely. And I would say that while India certainly should make an effort to reset, and I'm quite willing to play a part in that, at the same time, New Zealand should encourage its own private sector to look fresh in India. I give the example of a country of comparable population size, Israel, where tech companies have moved into India in a big way. They come up with a glimmer of an idea, but they just don't have the thousands of techies in Israel, and they won't have in New Zealand either, to do the kind of development work to take that idea forward and make a viable product or software or technology product that can then be marketed around the world. So Israeli companies finding brains and bodies in India is turning out to be a winner for them. And I would say the same logic could apply to New Zealand. If there are technology companies here challenged by the fact that the available brain power is so limited, this is the time for some of them to say, why don't we open up our company in India and tap into the available talent there? You'll find that it's a very receptive environment. That's one example of something that the private sector can also do. For India's part, I really think we should talk to the dairy industry, but why should they be so resistant to technology coming
Chidambaram
in?
told me, sir, in 2006 when he
Right.
visited,
Yeah.
he said, for India, agriculture is livelihood. For you, it is trade. So we have to look after livelihood of our people. So let's talk outside of this sector and see. And he offered service sector. He said, we'll give you FTA on service sector. At that point of time, New Zealand said, give us full meal. We don't want piecemeal of breakfast. That anyway. So there has been a standoff kind of a thing. But someone like you coming in might bring in a little more pragmatism. Are you meeting any of the leaders here?
Not really, no. In fact, it really is a personal visit, and frankly, since we are not yet in government, it would probably be inappropriate.
No, as a member of parliament.
I know. I could have added Wellington to this, but to be honest, the only reason I'm here at all is because I made a commitment to the Auckland Writers Festival before my party invited me to be a quote-unquote star campaigner around the country. So I can't afford to add any days to my presence here. I'll do the festival and rush right back for the last 10 days of campaigning. Because that's such an important election for us. In many ways, it's a battle for the soul of India. And I think that we have to really take it very seriously. So I'm looking forward to going back and campaigning very, very much more intensively. But at the end of all of that, if we get the results we expect and I believe deserve, we will have an opportunity to rethink all of these issues.
Last question to you, sir. How soon and how well will you liberate the media?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, they've always been liberated under Congress rule, except for the horrible emergency
75.
of 22 months between 75 and 77. The freedoms that the media enjoyed are not such a distant memory. Look back at the last couple of years of the UPA government, which was essentially defeated by the media. Mr. Modi piggybacked on the free press, which was attacking us day in and day out for sins real and imagined, mainly imagined, I might add. And the result was that while they were doing that, the opposition, whether it was in the form of Mr. Kejriwal and his rising movement, or Mr. Modi and the BJP, were taking advantage of the attacks on the Congress party and on the Congress party government in the media and by the CAG and all sorts of people in order to come to power. So the Congress has an unblemished recent track record when it comes to freedom of expression. And we will certainly want to restore that. In any case, I'm a bit of a fundamentalist on these matters. I mean, there are some restraints that culture and society require in our country, which may not be applicable in the Western world. But for the most part, I would say that freedom is good for all of us. And that freedom of expression is as vital to a society, to use the famous metaphor, as the canary is that is sent down to the bottom of a mine shaft to see if there's enough oxygen there for the miners to be sent down. If the canary comes up either dead or suffocating and choking for air, you don't send the miners down. It's a warning bell. And similarly, the free press is the canary in the mine for our society. If the press is stifled and is suffocating, then the whole society is endangered. And I would say that today that's what's happening.
That's what Nehru said. I would rather have an erring press than a suppressed press.
There you go.
Lastly, sir, very last question. Let me ask you what Karan asked Prabhakar. How well do you think the India Alliance will sit in Delhi if given the opportunity to form the next
Look,
government?
I am confident, but I would argue that it almost doesn't matter. First of all, every coalition government in India has done a better job in terms of economic growth and development
But I thought
than any
Rajiv
single
Gandhi
party.
did better on his own.
No. Unfortunately, that's not true. The single party governments, including ours, do not have
We
overall...
had a record unbeaten majority.
Yes, but in terms of economic growth, he was outstripped by the coalition governments that followed. In fact, the best period of economic growth in Indian history was in a series of coalition governments. From 91 to 2009 or 10 was our best 3 decades. Best 2 decades of economic growth, starting with Narasimha and going through to Manmohan Singh. And the fact is that all those were coalition governments. So was Mr. Vajpayee's in between. So we have to understand that coalitions are not a bad thing. Secondly, if by any chance you worry that the government will fall in less than the full 5 years, which is always a possibility with a coalition government, I'd like to think not because of the looming and ever-present danger of the BJP, but even if that were to be the case, it would at least have arrested the momentum of India's current irresistible or seemingly irresistible slide towards tyranny, which in my view is far worse for the country than just actually.
So you think the government has doctored the 8.6% growth narrative? And the growth is really far low?
No. In fact, India's statistics are now considered unreliable, which was not the case till 10 years ago. We had a very, very good reputation, particularly by comparison with countries like China.
7.6 under Manmohan Singh.
Depends on what your frame of reference is, what your base year
You
is,
said
how
the
you
overall
calculate.
GDP growth.
No, I think that overall GDP growth is much better under Manmohan Singh, and that the setbacks we've seen to farmers, to the SME sector, to the average public because of demonetization, all of that under Mr. Modi have not been compensated for. When you say that 80% of the Indian population has witnessed a decline in income, that's a stark figure. If all the gains of economic growth have been confined to the top 20%, then what's the value of that growth?
Right. Sir, one last final.
That's your third.
No,
last
no,
question.
and I'm
So
not
I have-
asking
I have
questions.
enough.
Your statement to the people of New Zealand.
Oh, I think it's a lovely country. I would like it to keep losing to India at cricket, but apart from that,
Trade.
I think trade really we need to develop much, much more. And I'm certainly going to be a very strong voice for doing that.
Thank you very much, sir.
All the best. And I'm delighted by the literary inclinations of the book reading public here, and the fact that you do have the Auckland Writers' Festival every year is a tribute to some of the wonderful qualities that New Zealand gives the world. Good to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Indian Newsling podcast.